Hi, I'm Daryl Ehrlich from Wilson Marine, and today I'm going to help familiarize you with your new Mercury 4-stroke outboard. This motor is water cooled, meaning it's got to suck water up from the lake for cooling the motor. How that happens is there's an impeller that sucks water through intakes on both sides of the drive unit. This is the one on the right hand side. There's a similar one on the other. Water is going to come in there, circulate through the power head, and come back out with the exhaust through the hub of the propeller. Some amount of water, however, is going to show up here at this, we call it a telltale. When the motor is running, there will be a stream of water spraying out here, and that basically is an indicator to the operator that you do have sufficient water flow for cooling the motor. Always have the motor submerged when it's running. You never want to start this motor dry. It'll burn up the rubber impeller that's in the drive unit. So always have those intakes submerged in water before you start this motor. On this side, I want to point out a flushing device located right here on the side of the motor. If you operate frequently in water that's got a lot of sediment in it, sand, muck, vegetation, you're going to suck those in through those intakes, and over time those contaminants and sediment can settle out in the cooling passages of the motor. If and when that happens, it can impact cooling performance of the motor. So the way Mercury is combating that is to have a flushing device here. Basically the way this works is with the motor not running, take this out, put a garden hose on here, turn it on halfway, and let this run 10-15 minutes. What that'll do is flush, circulate water through the motor and rinse out any contaminants that have settled out over in the motor. When you're done using that, simply thread this back onto this mount, closes off that hose, and quarter turn back in the motor. Also on this side of the motor is your tilt trim switch. There's a similar one up on the throttle control. Let's go ahead and open up the hood and look underneath. The hood has one latch in back. Usually use my thumbs, lift up on the latch and pull up on the rear. Kind of hinges from the front. There's a hook on the front here that engages with the lower housing. So what I want to point out on this motor, engine oil. So it's coated yellow for quick, easy reference. This is the dipstick. You want to check oil often. In fact, the owner's manual says check it every time you take the boat out. Basically, every day of use you want to check oil. So check it often. If you need to add oil, this is the oil fill here, again coated in yellow. The type of oil, let me pull this cover off, is called out here. We'll focus in. Right here is the oil. It's 10W30. Use Mercury marine oil. Don't use automotive oil. Mercury oil is better suited for marine environments where there's water constantly and higher RPM, higher load conditions. Their oil is better suited for that. There's also some good maintenance info on here that I'm going to cover in just a bit. So that's a good reference on this front cover. The other thing as far as engine oil, your engine oil filter is located here, and this is your engine oil drain right there. The other thing that we can point out on this side of the motor, there are some fuses. This cover goes in here like this, and right there conveniently there's a call out for fuses. Can you zoom in on that? Got it? So it basically calls out there's a fuel system, a diagnostic, ignition fuse, and a helm fuse, and there's some spares inside the case. The case is right here. So that basically pulls off. So there's your fuses, and then there's some spares that get mounted inside the case right here. So I'll just put that back on and snap this cover back on. The other thing to point out here, zoom in, there's a fuel filter right there, low pressure fuel filter, just a canister with quick connect fittings on each end. And I'm going to talk about maintenance items in a bit, and that's going to be one of those items. Let's go ahead and put the cover back on. Get that front hooked in, pull down on the rear, and then you always want to make sure that you're fully seated. Give it a good shake so you don't lose that as you're cruising across the lake. From a maintenance perspective, there's three things to be concerned with. One is engine oil, one is gear lube in the lower unit, and the third is fuel. As far as engine oil, the rule is 100 hours or once per season, whichever comes first. There's an exception to that. The very first engine oil change is done sooner at 20 hours. That way the engine oil that was in the motor during the break-in period gets pulled out sooner. So 20 hours for the very first, and then thereafter 100 hours or once per season. The exact same thing with the gear lube in the lower unit. It's 100 hours or once per season, except the very first one done sooner at 20 hours. Thirdly, the little fuel filter that I showed you inside, it's got quick connect fittings. That one is to be inspected seasonally and replaced if needed. All those items you would want to do at the end of the season. That way any kind of trace amounts of water or contaminants are pulled out of the motor for winter storage. That way you don't worry about corrosion or freezing of water that might damage parts of the gear drive unit or the engine. And you've got the added benefit that in the spring your boat's ready to go. You don't have to worry about getting your oil changed or drive lube surfaced. There is a 10-hour break-in period for the motor. For the first 2 hours, try to avoid full throttle. You can do it, just don't spend much time there. But basically for the first 2 hours, stay like maximum 2/3 to 3/4 throttle, or stay under 4,500 RPM. Red line is going to be closer to 6,000, so just keep it more like 4,500 RPM or lower. That's for the first 2 hours. Then for the next 8 hours, just vary the engine speed from idle to full throttle is not a problem. Just avoid long periods of full throttle. The owner's manual references staying up there at full throttle maybe only 5 minutes at a time. So you can do it, just limit the amount of time there, 5 minutes max at a time. The other thing you'd want to do during that 10-hour break-in period is make sure you don't have any long extended periods of idle. That's something that's not good for the motor as well. The motor is best broken in under various engine speeds and engine loads, and idling for long periods of time would not be good. As far as fuel for your motor, it's designed to run on regular pump fuel, 87 octane and up to 10% ethanol. Never want to run anything higher than 10% ethanol. That's definitely a problem. But anyway, it's designed to run on regular pump fuel. Where you can have issues with ethanol, even at 10%, is if the fuel is in this boat for long periods of time. And by that I mean maybe 2-3 months or more. What can happen is, besides the fuel becoming stale, you can also, from the ethanol, experience phase separation. Basically, the ethanol absorbs water from the atmosphere, combines with the water, and settles out to the bottom of the tank. When that happens, the mixture of ethanol and water is very corrosive, so that's not good for the fuel system components. And if it gets sucked up to the motor, it's just not going to run very well. So there are several ways to combat that. First is just use your boat a lot. If you're using the boat a lot, just using a lot of fuel, the ethanol is not in there long enough to cause any problems. The other one is to use fuel that doesn't have ethanol, like recreational fuel. That is a little more costly option. The third is to use a conditioner that's out there to help combat phase separation. Mercury, this is an example, their product called Quick Care. It's designed to combat that phase separation problem. So if you run this every tank full, and it's like 1 ounce for every 10 gallons, pretty economical. I think this bottle's like 12 bucks. So it's pretty economical. Just run this. You won't have any problems with the ethanol. The other thing is, if you did have fuel in this boat for long periods of time, again, 2-3 months or more, besides the phase separation, you're going to have problems with the fuel just becoming bad, becoming stale. And at that point, you'd want to use a fuel stabilizer. Again, this is Mercury's product. It's called Quick Store, similar to Stable, other products out there for fuel stabilization. So long periods of time, you'd want to use a product like this for stabilizing the fuel, and a product like this to prevent phase separation from ethanol. Okay, we've hopped up into a boat. I'm going to go over throttle controls and starting the motor. This happens to be a pontoon boat we're in, but it doesn't matter. The same applies whether you're in a pontoon boat, runabout, fishing boat, cruising boat. They're all going to be exactly the same as far as functionality. They may just be laid out a little bit different. So this is your throttle lever. It's got the tilt trim switch on the side for the motor. There's safety lanyard here and ignition switch. The way these safety lanyards work is if this gets pulled, this red toggle switch gets toggled down, and at that point the motor's not going to run. So the way you work this is put this little loop back in and flip that red toggle switch up. Highly recommend the operator clip this to himself. It's just a good reminder that anytime you leave the helm, you should turn that motor off. So wear that lanyard. So the procedure is lanyard in place, trim the motor down. You want to make sure the water intakes are covered with water before you start this motor, and you've got to be in the neutral position. You can feel this detent right here. Got to be in neutral. If you're like that, clutched in gear, the motor's not going to start. So neutral position. At that point, we can turn the key. This boat is not on the water. I don't have a battery, so it's not actually going to start. We'll just pretend it's running. So we turn the key and it'll start. One of the first things we want to do is look back over your shoulder when the motor's running, and we're going to look for that spray of water, that stream of water out of the telltale on the motor. That's going to assure us that we have a good flow of cooling water for the motor. The shifter itself, some shifters, this one doesn't have it, but will have a safety interlock, a neutral lock, where you've got to squeeze a red trigger underneath here in order to get out of the neutral position. So that could be a little bit different on some shifters. The other thing you want to do is once you're running and you engage into gear, you want to practice positive shift. What you want to avoid is a slow maneuver like this. In fact, sometimes as the clutches are starting to engage on the motor, you can hear kind of a ratcheting sound. That's just not good for long-term durability. So what you want to do is, instead of a slow maneuver, you want to get a good positive shift into gear. And eventually you'll find that place where the engagement happens and you'll be able to get right to it. And then the throttle will commence shortly after that. So again, nice positive shifting, whether it's forward or reverse. Trim angle. First, let me talk about this. There is a feature here. It's a throttle only feature. There's a button on the side of the lever. When you press that in and advance the throttle, you're actually not going to go into gear. You've basically disengaged the shift cables at that point, and you're only going to have the throttle control. That might be a nice feature that you want to use on a cold day when you want to warm up the motor before you go on a cruise. When you return the lever to the neutral position, you may have noticed the button pops out. It basically resets. The next time you move into forward or reverse, it's going to go into gear. Trim angle, like I said, we're on a pontoon boat. Motor trim angle isn't going to have a significant effect on the performance of a boat like it would in a runabout or fishing boat or a cruising boat, where it'd be more significant. But the whole idea is to make sure that you're trimmed all the way down before you try to get up on plane. Let's say we're in a fiberglass runabout. You'd want to be trimmed all the way down. Go ahead and hit the throttle, come up on plane. When you're at plane and you back off to your desired cruising speed, at that point you'd want to trim up the motor a little bit till you find the optimal trim angle. Basically the idea is less hull in the water equals less drag. If you're trimmed down, you're pushing a lot of hull down into the water. So you can actually trim up. It's going to raise the bow. You're going to have less hull in the water. You're going to increase engine speed, and you're going to increase boat speed a little bit at a constant throttle. So you want to use the trim position to find that optimized engine speed and boat speed at any given throttle. If you're over trimmed up or out, You may start experiencing the boat starting to porpoise. That's the nose of the boat bouncing up and down uncontrollably. That's an indicator that you're trimmed up too high and you'd need to trim down. The other thing you may experience is the prop actually ventilating because it's up too close to the surface of the water and starting to suck air down in front of the prop instead of pulling water from in front of the prop. If that happens, you're going to see a drastic drop in boat speed and you'll hear a difference in the motor. Anyway, that's another indicator that you're trimmed up too high and that you'd need to trim down a little bit.